Holy Thursday, Evening Mass of the Lord's Supper.
A reading from the book of Exodus. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, "This month shall stand at the head of your calendar. You shall reckon it the first month of the year. Tell the whole community of Israel, on the 10th of this month every one of your families must procure for itself a lamb, one apiece for each household. If a family is too small for a whole lamb, it shall join the nearest household in procuring one, and shall share in the lamb in proportion to the number of persons who partake of it. The lamb must be a year-old male and without blemish. You may take it from either the sheep or the goats. You shall keep it until the 14th day of this month, and then, with the whole assembly of Israel present, it shall be slaughtered during the evening twilight. They shall take some of its blood and apply it to the 2 doorposts and the lintel of every house in which they partake of the lamb. That same night they shall eat its roasted flesh with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. This is how you are to eat it, with your loins girt, sandals on your feet, and your staff in hand. You shall eat like those who are in flight. It is the Passover of the Lord. For on this same night I will go through Egypt, striking down every firstborn of the land, both man and beast, and executing judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I, the Lord. But the blood will mark the houses where you are. Seeing the blood, I will pass over you. Thus, when I strike the land of Egypt, no destructive blow will come upon you. This day shall be a memorial feast for you, which all your generations shall celebrate, with pilgrimage to the Lord as a perpetual institution." The word of the Lord.
Our blessing cup is a communion with the blood of Christ. Our blessing cup is a communion with the blood of Christ. How shall I make a return to the Lord for all the good He has done for me? The cup of salvation I will take up, and I will call upon the name of the Lord. Our blessing cup is a communion with the blood of Christ. Precious in the eyes of the Lord is the death of His faithful ones. I am your servant, the son of your handmaid. You have loosed my bonds. Our blessing cup is a communion with the blood of Christ. To you will I offer sacrifice of thanksgiving, and I will call upon the name of the Lord. My vows to the Lord I will pay in the presence of all His people. Our blessing cup is a communion with the blood of Christ.
A reading from the first letter of St. Paul to the Corinthians. Brothers and sisters, I received from the Lord what I also handed on to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the night He was handed over, took bread, and after He had given thanks, broke it and said, "This is my body that is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way also the cup, after supper, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the death of the Lord until he comes. The word of the Lord.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John. Before the feast of Passover, Jesus knew that his hour had come to pass from this world to the Father. He loved his own in the world, and he loved them to the end. The devil had already induced Judas, son of Simon the Iscariot, to hand him over. So, during supper, fully aware that the Father had put everything into his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God, he rose from supper and took off his outer garments. He took a towel and tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and dry them with a towel around his waist. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Master, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus answered and said to him, "What I am doing you do not understand now, but you will understand later." Peter said to him, "You will never wash my feet." Jesus answered him, "Unless I wash you, you will have no inheritance with me." Simon Peter said to him, "Master, then not only my feet but my hands and head as well." Jesus said to him, "Whoever has bathed has no need except to have his feet washed, for he is clean all over. So you are clean, but not all." For he knew who would betray him. For this reason he said, "Not all of you are clean." So when he had washed their feet and put his garments back on and reclined at table again, he said to them, "Do you realize what I have done for you? You call me teacher and master, and rightly so, for indeed I am. If I therefore, the master and teacher, have washed your feet, you ought to wash one another's feet. I have given you a model to follow, so that as I have done for you, you should also do." The Gospel of the Lord.
The first reading is from Exodus chapter 12, verses 1 to 8 and 11 to 14. This is the account of the first Passover that the Israelites celebrate when they're being freed from slavery in Egypt. We hear about the procedure that's to be followed. A year-old lamb of the sheep or the goats is to be killed. None of its bones are to be broken. And some of its blood is to be put on the lintel of the door as a sign that devout Jews live within that building. It's a sign of protection. Remember, blood signifies life. So this is life that protects one from the angel of death, which is to pass through Egypt that night. The people are to eat that lamb, and they're to eat it with their loin skirt and sandals on their feet. In fact, Jewish people for many centuries after that would eat exactly that way. Because when they recounted the Passover story, as they ate the Passover meal, they were not simply commemorating a past event, but rather entering into that event. They were living that event in their own life. It's the same idea we have with the celebration of the Mass, that when we celebrate the Mass, we're not in Buffalo or Los Angeles. We're at the Last Supper. We're at the cross. We're at the resurrection. And in fact, as we begin the Holy Triduum, we pass outside of time. The Triduum is not three separate events. It's one event that occurs outside of history. And so, in a certain sense, these days of the Triduum, we enter into eternity. Now, the Passover originally was probably an agricultural feast. The word in Hebrew is Pesach, which means leaping. And it probably referred to the leaping of the newborn lambs. So to celebrate the birth of the newborn lambs, one would sacrifice a year-old lamb as a way of giving something back to the Lord. Well, it acquired a historic meaning with the liberation of the Israelites from their slavery in Egypt. And we're told that this was a memorial for all time. It's fairly clear as you read the history of the Old Testament, it wasn't celebrated continuously, that in fact at certain stages of Israelite history, it had to be reenacted, it had to be begun again, because it had dropped out of practice. The second reading is from 1 Corinthians 11, 23 to 26. This is the oldest written account of the Last Supper. Remember, the Gospels are written about 15 years to 25 years after 1 Corinthians. So this is Paul's version of what happened at the Last Supper. Jesus takes the bread and says, "This is my body." In Aramaic, it would be gufi, my body, indicating that that truly is him. He says, "Do this in remembrance of me." Now, at one level, this is like the remembrance of the Passover. Every time we do this, we recall the event and enter into the event. But at another level, "do this in remembrance of me" means when you do this, please pray for me. Jesus is saying that when you celebrate this Eucharist, not only am I there for you, but I need you to be there for me. Jesus, who is God, needs nothing, and yet he asks for our love. He asks us to respond to his love. And so the Eucharist is a moment in which we can be there for Jesus. Because remember, the Eucharist is a remembrance of the cross also. At the Eucharist, we're standing under that cross, and we're asked to be the beloved disciple, the one who will not abandon Jesus. When Jesus takes the cup, he says, "This is the cup of the new covenant in my blood." Now, this is the version of the consecration of the wine that we find in the Greek rendering of the institution words, in Luke and Paul. In the Aramaic version, in Matthew and Mark, we hear this is the cup of the blood of the new covenant. So in Matthew and Mark, what's inside that cup? Blood. In Luke and Paul, what's inside the cup? Covenant, which was instituted in Jesus' blood. It's a little bit of a softening because the idea of drinking blood sounded like cannibalism. So Paul, who was addressing that Greek audience, didn't want to scandalize them. He softened the words just a bit. The Gospel comes from John 13, 1 to 15. We hear that it's the feast of the Passover, and in fact in the Gospel of John, the meal that Jesus is eating is actually an anticipation of the Passover meal. There were so many pilgrims in Jerusalem that there weren't enough rooms for them all to eat the Passover meal in one of the halls that was available on Passover night. So the rabbis allowed you to anticipate it by a night if you couldn't get a room Passover itself. That seems to be what Jesus did in the Gospel of John, because we hear that when Jesus is arrested, they take him to the house of Pilate, but the leaders of the Jews can't enter the house because they want to eat the Passover meal that night. The implication is that Jesus actually died on Preparation Day, not on Passover Day, which means that at the very moment Jesus is being crucified, that's the exact same time they're killing the Passover lambs. A beautiful symbolism. Jesus knows he's from the Father and he's going to the Father. So he knows his divinity. What he does at the Last Supper does not deny his divinity, it manifests it. And what does he do? In this Gospel, he washes the feet of the disciples. This is the spiritual meaning of the Eucharist, Jesus who serves us. We heard the physical meaning of the Eucharist in chapter 6 in John's Gospel, where he says that the bread of life is his flesh for the life of the world. In that Gospel, they emphasized real presence. In this Gospel, what's emphasized is the horizontal dimension of the Eucharist, service of brothers and sisters. Jesus washes the feet of the disciples, but Simon Peter doesn't want his feet washed. Why is he hesitant? He doesn't want to be served. Most of us would much rather serve somebody else rather than to ask for help. But the opposite side of the coin of service is allowing oneself to be served. Because if we only serve and never let others help us, it might well be an expression of neurotic energy, that it's really not love we're showing, but rather we're trying to buy the love of others. If we allow ourselves to be vulnerable, if we allow ourselves to be served, it shows that we fully understand what love is all about. And Jesus tells the disciples that they're to wash each other's feet. Inasmuch as he's given himself in the Eucharist, inasmuch as he's given himself on the cross, we are called to do the same. That we are called to not only repeat his action, but to live his action, to be part of that sacrifice, where we become priests who offer up a sacrifice on the altar of our lives, and a sacrifice is our very life. And may God bless us.